talk about occurred to a lady by the name of Charmin Scott, who was a worker at the office where I work as a bookkeeper. And she found out I was a UFO researcher and told me about an experience she had when she was 14 years old in 1989 in Mount Olive, Louisiana, a small town where she lived. And she had just gone through puberty and was walking home with her friends, her sister and her friend, when this UFO came swooping down right above them and sent down a beam of light on all three of them. Her sister and her friend scattered, but Charmaine became locked inside this beam of light. They were all terrified when this UFO came swooping down, but the instant the light hit her, she said it was very strange. All the fear left her. She became totally calm and, in fact, elated. She said it was as if the entire world disappeared, and she felt an intense feeling of peace and calm and tranquility, unlike anything she's ever felt before or since. This is definitely something I've heard many times. These beams of light have this ability to put you in sort of a state of complete calm. And she could hear her mother screaming. They were right in front of their house. Her mother saw this too. She was banging on the kitchen window. And her friends are screaming at her, run, run, run. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed. And finally, her friend reached into the beam of light and pulled her out. She was just beginning to feel this feeling of weightlessness. And he pulled her out. This craft quickly zoomed over the house, right over a tree, breaking off a branch of the tree, and zipped straight upwards, became a little star-like object in the sky, and disappeared. I think that this is what I would call an averted abduction attempt. She never had an experience after this. She never had one before this. This is a one-off, which is very unusual, because normally this is something that people experience throughout their lifetime. And I suspect that the ETs had come down because she had just gone through puberty and was now, of reproductive age. And they were interested in this because of their agenda to produce hybrid babies. That's pure speculation on my part, but it is a pattern I see again and again. Next case I want to cover briefly occurred in Topanga Canyon, California. This is right off the coast of Southern California, between Malibu, Santa Monica, right outside LA. It's a huge, huge hot spot. There was a gigantic wave of sightings in 1992 to 1994. I wrote a whole book about it. It involved cars being chased down the road, being lifted up into the sky, landings, objects hovering over homes, abduction cases, and so forth. And after putting out the book, I got more cases, including this one, involving an entire family who lived on this road high on the ridge, pictured here. This is not the exact spot, but it's very close. They didn't want their exact location known. This is along Tuna Drive, which overlooks this fairly rural community outside of LA. And as they came down their very long 1,000-foot driveway, which is, their home is not visible from the road, they saw a huge silver craft landed in their front yard, landed or maybe a foot above the ground. And there were 6 people in the car. They all saw it. They jumped out of the car and ran to the house and got everyone out of the house. There was 3 or 4 people in the house. And they were about 50 feet away from this craft, which was just sitting there. It had no portholes. It was gigantic, maybe 50 to 100 feet across. And it stood there for maybe 3 minutes and then very silently lifted up, moved leisurely upwards and south towards the ocean, and moved off. And they were calling to it, waving, saying, come back, come back. None of them were scared. This is what I would call a display. Most often, UFOs are pretty evasive. It appears that they don't want to be seen, but there's another sort of flip side to that. They do want to be seen and will put on what amounts to a display. I think in this case, they were showing themselves off on purpose. None of them believed that they had missing time. There was no landing traces whatsoever seen in this field. But it's a very, very close-up sighting without any possibility of misperception. And landings, especially during the day, as this was, are very, very rare. So it's a really cool case and just very interesting. Here's a very interesting case which took place in San Pedro, I believe it was, in 1973. No, I'm sorry, San Dimas, to a gentleman by the name of Gary. He and his friends would often go up into the mountains above this golf course pictured here. There was a little dirt road that led up to this little spot that they liked to hang out. It was this little dip in the mountain, which had a little secret valley, sort of, a little field which dipped down and no one could see you from below. And they would often go up there and just hang out and drink some beers and shoot the breeze. And one evening, that's what they were doing, 1973, 5 of them. And this was a tough crowd. They were pretty tough, rough and tumble teenagers who weren't really scared of anything and often got into trouble. And they were up there. It's a very steep switchback road, very difficult to get up. And it had just reached this field when they saw something on the far end of the field. It stretched from one end to the other. It was extremely large, a couple of 100 feet, very bright. It was clearly some sort of craft. Couldn't have been a helicopter. It was far too large for that. There was no way it could have been a vehicle because the road would never have been able to, sustain something of that size driving up there. Whatever it was had to have come from the air. Couldn't have been a plane. Plane couldn't land in that field. So all this is going through their heads. And it's got very, very bright lights on it. They can't quite see what it's made of, but it appears to be metallic. The lights are so bright they couldn't quite discern the shape. But what really concerned them was they could see humanoids, what looked like tall human-looking figures, maybe 6 feet, maybe a little larger, broad-shouldered, walking back and forth on what looked kind of like a catwalk type thing around the craft. And they're just staring at it in absolute awe, trying to figure out what this could possibly be. It was totally silent. And at some point, one of these figures apparently noticed them and started approaching them at a very brisk walk, marching towards them. And they shouted out, "Who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you here? Who are you?" Over and over again. The guy I interviewed, Gary, had walked off a short distance away from the car. Everyone else was kind of stuck to the car, a little nervous, but he had walked forward and around trying to get a better view of this thing until this figure started walking towards them. This figure never answered them. And when he got within about 50 feet, they completely panicked. They piled back into their car, turned around and headed like a bat down the road and went straight to the police. They did not look back. And they went to the police station. The policeman was very sympathetic, took their testimony, and they begged him to go up there and check this out because there was something very weird going on, and he agreed to do it. And he went up there and came back. They called the police station and talked to him, and he said, "No, there was nothing up there. Sorry, I didn't see anything." So they went back up there the next morning and scouted out the whole area, and there was zero evidence of any craft. So they're not sure what happened here. This is a landing involving humanoids. They are 100% convinced this was not military or anything like this because the craft was just too large. I suppose there is a possibility it was military, but they don't believe so. What really puzzled them was the fact that this figure which was marching towards them acted in a pretty threatening manner and never communicated with them at all. So it's a strange encounter, definitely. He called me up several times just to talk about it. And because like many experiencers, they don't have a lot of people to talk to about it. And we often would talk, he would call me periodically throughout the years and we talk about this. I couldn't find any other sightings in this area around that time, but it's definitely a very interesting case. And here's another fascinating sighting, which took place in 1997 at Moss Landing, This is in central California, near Monterey. Involves the main witness is Joy Williams and her husband, Tom, who have no history of encounters. She's a military brat. She's seen all kinds of craft. They were having dinner one evening at a friend's house in Aptos, which is right along the coast. It overlooks the Monterey Bay. And she went out onto the deck, the veranda there, the balcony of the home, which overlooks the Monterey Bay, just to enjoy the stars and the view of the bay, which is about a quarter mile away. And she saw a glow in the water. And as she watched, this glow got brighter and brighter, and this craft came rising up out of the water. She said it was huge, probably 50 feet across, kind of yellowish in color. She drew the drawing here, you see to the left. She could see the kelp and the seaweed coming off of it. She called out her husband and her friend. They all viewed it. They had a telescope mounted on the veranda. They viewed it through the telescope and watched it through this whole telescope area and could see that there were portholes or perhaps lights alternating around the circumference of this craft. And as they watched, it started moving along the coastline towards the Moss Landing coal power plant and hovered directly over the chimneys there and stopped. And at this point, it extended a long arm, as you can see pictured here, which was twice the length of the craft itself. So it was huge. She estimates that the pincers themselves that were on the end of this extended arm were probably 20 feet across. And it started digging into the opening of the Moss Landing chimneys. And it stayed there for a good 20 minutes. They called the police and said what they were, described what they were seeing. The policeman was very friendly at first. And as they described what they were seeing, he realized that they were describing a UFO. And he says, it's probably just a boat. It's a boat you're seeing. And they were both on different lines. They said, no, it's in the sky. It's floating in the sky. And it's digging into the chimneys there. And he became quite hostile and belligerent and refused to listen or take their testimony and basically ended the call. They got no help. They called the local radio station. No one else was reporting anything. And after about 20 minutes, this thing just blinked out, did not move away as far as they could tell. It blinked out. So this was a very unusual encounter, which again shows ET's interest in technological installations or power plants. There are many cases of UFOs hovering over nuclear power stations, dams, electrical power stations, Air Force bases, prisons, anything that's at all technological, they're there. And this case typifies that. I did some research and found that this Moss Landing coal power plant has been visited on at least 3 or 4 other occasions. On one instance, before and afterwards. One occasion involved a security guard who was monitoring the power plant, and he saw a orb which was circling around the power plant and going above the chimneys and looking inside of them. This is very much like what happened at the Morenci copper smelting plant, where a UFO was sending down orbs into the actual chimneys again. So I think they are studying our environment, our levels of pollution. I'm guessing that's what's going on here. But it's a very interesting case involving a USO that was investigating the Moss Landing power plant. Here's a case involving a whistleblower who contacted me from his hospital room on his deathbed. He was not expected to survive a chronic disease. He was very elderly. He has since passed away, but he really wanted to do his part for disclosure. He worked as a contractor for the military. He was a civilian, but had a job at Edwards Air Force Base. And when he said Edwards, my ears pricked up, because I had written a chapter about Edwards Air Force Base encounters for my book, UFOs over California. Edwards is a huge UFO magnet. It's had sightings since the 1940s, not only sightings, landings. There are accounts of crash retrievals and reverse engineering. This, of course, is where President Eisenhower allegedly had a meeting directly with ETs in 1954. Certainly a controversial case, but a lot of researchers take it quite seriously, and there's more and more information coming out confirming that 1954 Eisenhower meeting with Nordic-type ETs. This is where Gordon Cooper actually saw film of a landed UFO on the runway there. So yeah, Edwards is a UFO magnet. And when this witness describes what he told me, I was profoundly interested. And what happened was he was doing a job there for his employer, and they were walking by a hangar when they both heard this low thrumming noise. He, of course, turned to look, and just 50 feet away or so, this hangar had an large open window. He looked inside and saw a UFO. It was small, about the size of a little Toyota car, is how he described it. A Honda, actually, Accord is the words he used. And he said it was perfectly featureless, silver, no portholes or anything, and was floating, although there were cables attached to it. And he turned to his employer and said, "What the heck is that?" And his employer turned sheet white and jammed his finger up to his lips and said, "Shut up." Didn't actually spoke, but just made it clear that he was not to speak about it and to completely ignore it. And as they walked away, he asked again, "What was that? What was that?" And his employer said, "I'm not telling you. Do not ever ask me again. You are not supposed to see that." And refused to tell him what he saw. And that was the end of it for about a year or two, until this same employer called up the witness again and said, "I really, really need you for a job. This is an emergency. We've got no one else. And can you please do some work for us?" And the guy interviewed said, "No, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it unless you tell me what we saw." And he took him to lunch. They had some beers. They got him to a joking pissing contest, is how he put it. And finally got him drunk enough where he spilled the beans. And he says, "Okay, you can tell. I mean, I'll tell you, but you have to promise never to tell anyone else." I'm glad the witness broke that promise, because he felt people deserved to know what's going on. And what his employer said was that this was a part of what we now know as the failed Star Wars project, and it was involving, it wasn't our alien craft, but involved reverse engineering taken directly from extraterrestrial technology. He said how it worked was using counter-rotating magnets, which created a magnetic field on the outside of the object, which would propel it in the desired direction. So this is one of many, many cases that are now coming out from hundreds of whistleblowers, pointing towards the fact that our military is in possession of ET technology. It's not just Roswell. It's not just the Aztec craft or the Kecksburg, Pennsylvania craft, or the UFO crash in Arizona, or the so many cases, Shag Harbor UFO incident. There are hundreds of incidents involving these, what appear to be UFO crash retrievals and reverse engineering. And this is just one of many. So a very interesting case pointing towards the fact that our military is lying about what they know about UFOs and have their hands on this technology. Next case I want to talk about comes from another whistleblower. I'll just go through this one briefly because I don't want to run out of time here. But it involved a gentleman who had a top secret clearance and was an employee aboard the USS Kidd, a Navy ship. I verified his employment. He's for real, for sure. Doesn't want his name used, but was essentially invited to be part of the secret government. He was approached by someone because he had become very interested when the internet started. He started doing research on UFOs and connected with some people who were apparently within the secret government and were involved in UFO crash retrieval incidents in Vietnam. And from these guys, he learned that 2 UFOs were recovered in Vietnam, that they had sprayed Agent Orange not to keep away the enemy, but to clear the jungle so that they could recover these 2 UFO craft. And he was invited to go into this inner sanctum of the secret government and basically be part of the crash retrieval project. And he initially agreed until they told him, like, okay, you can come in, but you will not be able to have any contact with anyone. You will have to be single. At that time, he had just started a relationship with who would become his wife. And so he ultimately declined. But he kept in touch with these guys throughout the years and talked to some guys who worked directly at Area 51, who told him flat out that Area 51 does have reverse engineering. It goes many stories underground. There's a city there they call Phoenix, which houses some 10,000 employees, and that they reverse engineer alien craft. They do research into bacterial warfare, reverse engineering, genetics, and that at the lower levels, ETs are working along with humans. At the lowest levels, some of these are levels where humans aren't even allowed to enter unless they have an ET escort, and that they have to wear masks because the atmosphere is different. And he had some face-to-face meetings with some of these guys. And at one point, one of these guys he was in contact with actually transformed into a gray alien. And that frightened him quite a bit because it showed him that these ETs have the ability to basically walk among us and appear as humans. So there's quite a bit more to this case, but I'll just move on because I want to get to the, let's see, 10 more cases I have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 more cases I'd like to cover. And this next case is a classic. I'm sure you've heard of it before. This occurred on March 16, 1967 at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, where UFOs showed up and were viewed by numerous employees at this base, hovering over these missile silos, and actually shut down all of them, almost 20 of these nuclear-tipped Minuteman ICBM missiles. And I was contacted by a witness who was there. And boy, was I excited to hear him because he was actually on the ground and saw it firsthand. And there aren't a lot of witnesses who saw this firsthand. His name is Mel Hansen. He's quite elderly and wanted to do his part for disclosure. And the only reason he spoke was because he saw this incident being portrayed on television. And he thought, oh, well, I guess if they're talking about it, I can talk now, because he was told in no uncertain terms to never speak about it. And long story short, he was out there one evening. This is March 16th, 1967, when a UFO showed up over one of these missile silos. He was there to do routine maintenance. Other people were down below ground at the silo. He was on ground doing security. And this UFO showed up. He noticed it because it was occluding the stars, and it came very low over this missile silo, totally silent, freaked out the other guy he was with, the military police guy who was in the Jeep. And he radioed into his superiors and said, there's something over the missile silo. And they said, we will be there immediately. It takes them an hour to get there from the proper base itself, base central, because all these missile silos are quite spread out widely, and they're all independent systems that are not connected to each other. So meanwhile, other UFOs were appearing over other missile silo sites. This was causing a huge panic all over the base at very high levels. And this missile was shut down. It immediately went back on emergency generator power, and that went offline. And it went back online on battery power. There was, two fail-safe systems, and that went offline as well until this missile was completely dead. At one point, Mel got out of the Jeep against instructions because he wanted to get a closer view. He couldn't really see much except for a silhouette of this craft. And at some point, it moved away. And shortly later, the people from the base itself arrived and ordered him to go to the base itself, where he was debriefed and told to never ever talk about this, and that it didn't happen, and that if you talk about it, you will lose your job. So he never talked about it except with his buddies who were there at the time. They are now all deceased. He's quite elderly. And now, of course, Robert Salas has written a book about this called Fated Giant. He was there. Other witnesses have stepped forth. Researchers have documentation proving that these missiles were, in fact, shut down, though the documents themselves are scrubbed of any mention of UFOs. Government is still lying about this. I can see from their perspective why they might perceive this as a military, a threat. But I think this is a clear message from the ETs about nuclear power, and why are you messing around with it? I feel like it's just a friendly reminder that this is dangerous. They didn't damage these missiles in any way, and they were brought back online the next day. But it's a very interesting classic case in which more and more witnesses are stepping forward, including Mal Hansen. Here's another case which I like because it shows how someone can live their entire life as an experiencer and never know it. This gentleman contacted me because I had written an account of an ET, a 6-foot-tall grasshopper-like being, which was very similar to what he had experienced. He had gone with his brother and his parents to their grandparents' farm. And on the way back, they had missing time. Hold on one second.
Wow. This is great.
I'm busy right now.
Oh my God, this is so amazing, isn't it?
It's so good, yeah.
I'm literally sitting at the edge of my seat.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem, Preston. Yeah, it's great. You're doing a great job. We're loving it. So thanks so much. Yeah, okay, we'll keep going here.
So no more noise from this point on.
No problem.
So sorry. Yeah, sorry about all that banging. But at any rate, this gentleman contacted me because he had a very unusual experience. He was driving home with his family from his grandparents' house when they had missing time. He was just a kid. None of them had ever really thought about UFOs in any way. They had no ways to explain this missing time other than they're like, wow, we got home an hour, maybe 2 hours later than we should have. What happened? And following this missing time incident, he had a repetitive nightmare in which he was at the farmhouse being chased all over the house by a 6-7 foot tall humanoid grasshopper. And this repetitive dream plagued him. He also had a phobia of grasshoppers following this incident. He hated them, could not stand the sight of them. They terrified him. So he's dealing with these two elements, this repetitive nightmare and an unnatural fear of grasshoppers following this missing time incident, and didn't know what to make of it. And just this nightmare continued on through adulthood and slowly faded away. It would still occur every now and then, but it went away at some point. And he didn't make anything else of it and didn't think of UFOs or anything. One day he went to the doctor, and the doctor was like, what happened to your nose? It looks like you've had an operation. You have a really deviated septum. I've never seen a case this severe. And he says, nothing ever happened to my nose. What are you talking about? And the doctor says, well, it looks like something happened. And so that puzzled him. And that was another clue. And then one day he noticed a strange scoop mark on his body. And for some reason, it fascinated him, and he kept looking at it. And that's when he stumbled upon the UFO subject and started connecting the dots and wondered if what the heck was he an experiencer? He considered going under hypnosis because as he started reading, he realized he fit the profile of an experiencer with these nightmares, the missing time, the scoop marks, what looked like an operation on his septum. But he declined to go under hypnosis because he was afraid it was opening up a can of worms. But he did become obsessed by UFOs. He ended up publishing a newsletter near his home area in Florida, but never really moved beyond that. And one day he did confront his brother, his little brother, about this, all this stuff, and kind of told him what had happened to him. And his brother tilted his head and says, "Oh, that's funny, because around that time I also had a dream about grasshoppers." And his brother's like, "Really? What did you dream?" And his brother said, "Well, I dreamt that I came outside and you were covered from head to toe with 1,000 grasshoppers all over your body." And that completely freaked out the witness, and gave him, I think, confirmation that there was something to all this. And he later confronted his brother, said, "Describe that dream to me again." And his brother said, "What dream?" The grasshopper dream that you told me." And his brother said, "I never told you any dream about grasshoppers. What are you talking about?" He did not remember. So here we have this weird amnesia aspect, which turns up. I dealt with this myself, by the way. I had a sighting, which I completely forgot for several months until I suddenly remembered, in which an orb came right in front of my windshield and stopped my car. This was in Woodland Hills in 1992. And it was years later, I finally realized I probably had missing time, because I don't remember driving home or anything. So yeah, amnesia can happen with simple sightings as well. This is definitely a problem. If you ever see a UFO, I would absolutely recommend writing it down immediately and telling people about it, because it can all slip away quite easily. But this is a case which kind of typifies that and shows how probably the UFO experiences, the contactee experience, is far more widespread than people realize. And that's where this case sort of rests. He believes he's an experiencer, but he is not really willing to go any farther with it. Here's a very, very unusual case involving two gentlemen who work in San Francisco. They are street vendors making handmade jewelry on Beach Street in San Francisco. Beach Street is pictured right here. They sell their wares there, and they had a very unusual experience in 1981 where a UFO appeared overhead. It was very bizarre because these are two brothers. The main witness was trying to find his booth. They were just beginning to set up, and he was looking for his booth number when suddenly this voice, kind of this message, came into his head: "Don't look up." He had no intention of looking up, and it was odd. And it repeated again and again until finally he just looked up and saw this weird cloud-like object. And it was this bright glowing cloud. And his brother was approaching, and he said, look at this. Do you see this? And his brother saw it too. And they were absolutely fixated on it, hypnotized, entranced, watching this. And as they watched this object, which was several, 3,000 feet high, they estimate 2,000, became lower and lower and lower quite quickly. And the fog, the cloud dissipated, and inside was a very large football-shaped craft glowing on each end. It was kind of silvery white, it looked metallic. And as they watched, it sort of vibrated and turned into two craft. They were absolutely stunned. And by now it's just a couple of 100 feet up. And they're thinking, wow, this is absolute proof. Everyone here on Beach Street is seeing this. Everyone in the world is going to know UFOs are real. Probably people are taking pictures of this. But they could not take their eyes off this craft. And it was still moving down. And he shouted out, "Stop, stop, don't abduct me. I don't want to be taken." And at that point, it stopped instantly and began to raise upwards and moved off over the nearby island there and darted away. And they looked at each other, totally amazed, and then looked around, and nobody was reacting. Nobody was reacting in any way to this UFO sighting. Nobody else had seen it. That completely shocked them. There was no indication that anyone else even noticed these things. They could not understand it. And they were talking about it animatedly to each other, about how close it was. And finally, he turns to his brother and says, I got the weirdest message before this thing came, and which said in my head, don't look up, over and over again. And his brother got this wide-eyed look in his head and said, oh, I had a weird thought too, now that you mention it. I kept getting this message, look down at your shoelaces to see if they are untied. And he knew they were tied, but he kept looking down and seeing that they were tied, and that message kept repeating over and over again. So they kind of marveled about that. And now I'm wondering if there was direct telepathic communication from these ETs using what amounts to reverse psychology, saying, don't look at the pink, don't think about pink elephants type of thing, forcing them or encouraging them to look up. It was a very interesting sighting. And it didn't end there. This was not his only encounter. They were at the same location some 10 years later, and had a very strange encounter. The brother was off to the restroom, but the main witness had stepped away from his booth about 20 yards or so and was just watching as people walked by and looked at his rings and jewelry and stuff, when suddenly he saw this very unusual looking man and woman. They were both dressed in trench coats. And were normal human looking. The female was quite attractive, he thought. And the man was wearing a hat. And suddenly he heard this woman say in his head, he wasn't sure at first because it was puzzling to him. He was quite some distance from them, but he heard her say, is it okay if I go up to this booth and look at the jewelry here? And he said, okay, the gentleman. And he thought to himself, oh, I hope these people, approach and try on my rings so that I can, sell them some of my jewelry. And at that point, this female figure turned around and looked at him and telepathically spoke to him and said, here is why I cannot try on your rings. And she pulled her hands out of her pockets, which were in these deep pockets of this trench coat. And she hid them from everyone else kind of in front of her like that, and showed him her hands, which he said looked like crow's feet, which were very claw-like, and spoke to him telepathically and wiggled her fingers and said, this is why I cannot wear your rings. And he was shocked and looked up at her, and she was very friendly. And at that point, her partner, the gentleman with her, said, we have to go now and tell that gentleman not to follow us or there will be big trouble. And they walked right by him, he said, about 10 to 20 feet away. And she looked right at him, and he said her eyes were not normal. They were very large and completely black. And she said, do not follow us, telepathically to him. And he said, don't worry, I won't. I cannot follow you because I cannot leave my booth unattended. And off they walked. So this was a very unusual case of what appear to be human-looking ETs, or certainly, I don't know. It's just an unusual case. I don't know if it's connected to the early sighting. They both had another sighting following this, but that was really the extent of it. I brought this whole story up to a contactee who I know. I'm writing a book about her experiences right now. She's fully conscious since age 14. Had seen grays, reptilians, praying mantis, and a wide variety of other ETs, including the blue dwarfs I showed earlier. Has shown me photographs and physical proof of her case. I'm so excited about this next book. But at any rate, I asked her about this case, and she said, oh yes, I know of these people. And she said that, yes, they do have these claw-like hands. But it's an interesting case, and one of many, many in the literature, and of a few that I've investigated, in which apparent ETs are walking among us. I don't know, it's an unusual case, but certainly it impressed the witness. And why I think it's probably is ETs is because these people were dressed strangely. He heard them telepathically, and they looked strange, and their behavior was strange. So there's a number of strange elements to it that sort of all add up to this being an actual encounter. But of course, only the witnesses would know for sure, or only the actual ETs. Here's another very interesting case, which took place in, let's see, this was in Ontario, Canada, at Wasaga Beach, involving a gentleman who absolutely insisted upon anonymity. And as I interviewed him, it turned out he was a lifelong experiencer. As a very young kid, he had a visitation in his bedroom involving a humanoid and sleep paralysis. He doesn't really remember anything other than this strange, dark humanoid at his bedside. He could not describe it because it was too dark. And he did experience paralysis and thought that was the end of it. It was just one experience. But it certainly transformed his belief system. He became very spiritual. He's extremely analytical, very intelligent. He's a businessman and a philanthropist, and has done quite well for himself. As a teenager, he was pretty much only interested in girls and stuff like this, but became very spiritual and started exploring consciousness, the metaphysical aspects of pyramids and things like this. Met the girl who would become his wife. Had a few encounters with ghosts, some psychic encounters, but eventually stumbled upon the UFO subject, became intrigued by the idea of having close encounters using CE5 protocols, or basically calling down a UFO using meditation and lights and so forth. And went up on vacation with his future wife and did meditation and tried to call down a UFO, blinking their flashlight, and it worked. They had a very close-up sighting of this glowing object. And it came again the next night, and it was very close, and it was darting around. It was very, very impressive to them. So he was shocked. He had his UFO sighting. He had always wanted to see them up close, and he was very intrigued about having an actual face-to-face encounter with ETs. But at that point, it hadn't happened. It was a year later. He went with a group of friends to Wasaga Beach and rented a little cottage there along the beach. It was late in the evening, and he asked his friends if they wanted to go for a walk along the beach. And his friends were like, no, it's too late. But he felt compelled. He was like, come on, I have to do this. Let's go, let's walk along the beach. And they're like, no. And he finally convinced them to go. And so they're taking this short walk to the beach and just walking along the beach when suddenly the atmosphere changed. It says it became very electric. Everything became very still. The leaves stopped moving. The waves became quiet. And at this point, they could see what looked like a group of 3 people, strange-looking people, standing right next to the water up ahead, maybe 100, 200 yards away. They could all see them. And he was about to turn and ask his friends, like, look at those people. They look weird, don't they? And he turned to his best friend who was walking right next to him, and his best friend was frozen in place in mid-step, 1 foot up in the air. And he looked at the people in front of him, and they were all frozen in step. And he looked at the leaves on the trees, and they were perfectly still, and the waves weren't moving. Time was frozen. This is one of, a dozen cases at least that I've been involved with involving this weird sort of time-stopping phenomena. I'm not sure time is actually stopping. I mean, how would you stop time in the entire universe? That makes no sense at all. But I feel like people are being pulled out of the time stream or maybe into a different dimension. I have no idea what's happening here, but it's very odd. And he was freaking out because he could move. And he was like looking around and trying to figure out what the heck is going on, when suddenly he was disoriented and found himself right in front of these figures who were standing on the beach. And he said they were huge. They were easily 10 feet tall. And he said maybe they were 9 feet tall, but I'm pretty sure they were 10 feet tall because he's over 6 feet tall. And they were almost twice his height. So he's thinking they were 10 feet tall. And they looked strange. They were wearing shiny black jumpsuits with very high collars, what looked like helmets. They were humanoid looking, but had enormous dark, eyes that, not so much dark, but were kind of gold and blue limbed irises. I said that they were not pleasant to look at. Their skin was very thick looking and kind of cracked and scaly. And they had dirty, yellowed, jagged teeth, huge noses, and extremely large eyes, probably 2 to 3 size of a normal person, and just so tall. They were in a triangular position there, and he was looking up at them, and he was about to say to them, what are you doing here? Why are you here? You have no right to be here. And they said actually that they do have the right to be here. And let me just pull up this quote of what they exactly said. Give me just 1 second here, and I will find it, because I want to get these words exactly. He's like, "Who are you? You can't be here." And in chorus, speaking apparently audibly, he's not sure, but they all spoke at the same time. And they said in a loud, thick, gravelly voice, "We can come and go wherever we want. Nothing can stop us." So this was somewhat threatening, and it freaked him out, and he turned and ran because the power emanating from them was palpable. And so the air was itself electric. He didn't see any UFO, saw nothing like that. And he ran up to his friends and did not look back. And his friends were now walking down the pathway, facing away from the beach, going towards the cottage. And as he reached them, he was about to ask them about these figures, and he forgot. He absolutely could not think of what he was about to ask them. And he knew he was upset, and he wanted to tell them something, but by the time he was with them, it had all completely left his mind, and they all walked home, or to the cottage rather, went inside, and he became profoundly sleepy and could barely make it to the couch before he fell asleep. They all went directly to bed. That was unusual. And that was the extent of it until 2 weeks later, they decided to do it again, have another vacation at Wasaga Beach, rented the same exact cottage, and he's sitting there on the couch when suddenly the whole experience dropped into his mind spontaneously. He remembered all of it, and he freaked out. These were good friends. He's a young man at the time, and he started to ask them, like, "Do you guys remember last time we were here and we went on that walk to the beach?" They're like, "Oh yeah, of course." And he said, "Do you remember seeing those people on the shoreline?" And they said, yeah, those were weird looking people, weren't they?" And he said, "What happened? Do you remember what happened?" And they said, "Well, yeah, you ran up to talk to them." He says, "You do? You remember that?" And they're like, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you remember anything else?" And they're like, No. What did they say?" And he didn't really want to tell them because he had not told them he was having UFO experiences. He didn't want to bring it up that he'd met these 10-foot tall, weird looking beings. They were also completely casual about it, which also was curious to him because these beings looked unusual. He says, "Do you remember what they looked like?" And they're like, "Yeah, they were weird looking," but they wouldn't describe it beyond that. So that's where it basically ended. And he's had no further encounters since then. I don't know if he was taken or not. I suspect he may have been, because he did have that period of disorientation and missing time and doesn't remember how we got in front of them. But perhaps this was the result of his CE5 meditations, in which he had been repeatedly asking to meet ETs face to face. So this is a good message for anyone who's doing CE5 work. It does work. I've done it myself, but it can go all the way to a full-on face-to-face encounter, or even, an onboard encounter, which has occurred in some cases. So yeah, I love this case because these ETs are, as far as I can tell, unique. I've never heard anyone describe these types of beings before or since. All right, and now we get to the next case I'd like to talk about. There's just two more after this one. Gosh, I'm going a long time, aren't I? Hope that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's good. It's good, Preston. Yeah, we have some extra time, so it's all good.
All right.
Yeah.
So I'll wrap this up. So this gentleman is a bus driver, and he lives in Utah. His name is Don Anderson, and he had a very unusual experience as a young man. He was a single father, and woke up. He was very religious, profoundly religious. Woke up to see grays standing next to his bed and taking his infant son. And he's like, "What are you doing? You cannot take my son. If you're going to take my son, I am going with you." And they said, "That's fine." These were gray type ETs. And he said it was very strange because the instant he saw this gray, he recognized it as a friend and someone he had seen repeatedly throughout his life. He said it was almost like a near-death experience because all these memories came flooding back into his mind of weird childhood incidents that he had absolutely denied, explained away, or refused to think about. As a little kid, he had strange monkey-like beings coming to his bedroom and scaring the living daylights out of him. He told his mom, and it freaked out his mom. His mom was scared of him ever since. And would refuse to talk with. She's profoundly religious, but she did describe some very unusual incidents. Someone once came and took all the clothes off the line and folded it up and put it on the porch. That was really strange. He kept disappearing from his room. They called the police a couple of times. They wondered if he was having seizures. I mean, this was absolutely freaking his mother out. But finally, it ended. He had another time where he was walking near his house in the wilderness and came upon a herd of skunks, which chased him down the road. And now he realized that those weren't skunks at all. Those were grays who had pulled him on board a craft. He was taken inside. He saw all these screens throughout the inside of the craft. He said the craft looked exactly like that which was drawn by Bob Lazar of Area 51 fame. So all these various childhood incidents were coming back to him and being explained as ET incidents. He remembered. Another involved missing time with his friends, and he remembered being taken. But at this point now, this gray is taking him and his infant son through the wall, through the ground itself, through a little hillside, and into a craft which was landed on the other side of the hill. And he's pulled on board this craft. He's very calm. And inside he's greeted by a human-looking female dressed in a jumpsuit. She's quite attractive. And his little son runs forward. He's like 4 or 5 years old. Runs forward and into another room. And he turns to this female ET and says, "Can you heal me? I'm having a terrible case of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome." And she laughed. And he said, "What's so funny? I'm having problems with this." And she said, "Don't worry, you'll be just fine." And this being took her into the room where his little son had ran into. It was a large rounded room. And in the center was this column with electrical energy coming up and down it. And his son was playing with another little 5-year-old boy, and they were dipping their hands into this electrical stream and playing with it. Apparently it wasn't harmful because it would flow over their bodies. And this woman turned to him and showed him an image of a woman and said, "You will be meeting this woman. She will be your future girlfriend." And he's like, "Really?" And she said, "Yes, you will need to get to know this woman." So here we have another case where ET's, ET dating service or something along these lines. And that was the gist of this encounter. That was why he was taken on board, to be told this. And next thing he knows, he's being put back into his home with his son, and he can see other people, the neighbors, who are frozen in their living rooms. And he's put back in bed and wakes up the next morning absolutely profoundly changed. He abandoned his religion and began a long search for answers. He said it was a very difficult period in his life because at that time there was very little information on it. He wrote to UFOs. They never responded. And it was a long, hard journey for him to find answers. He became profoundly spiritual. He worked as a bus driver, but ended up starting a website in which he gave psychic readings and spiritual healings, which again fits the pattern of these cases. He was harassed by government agents who told him, "You are not to go public about your encounters." He was thinking about going public. And when he got harassed, he decided he was definitely going public. And he ended up speaking at a convention about some of his experiences. On another occasion, or he ended up meeting this woman who he was shown on board the UFO. It was a very odd encounter, very synchronistic. He met her online. It turned out she was from across seas. She was from a foreign country, and the chances of him meeting her were almost minuscule, but she ended up moving over and they had a fairly long, successful relationship. It wasn't long after this encounter that new neighbors moved in, and it turned out to be that same boy that his child had seen. They became best friends for a number of years until the kid moved away. That was odd because at that time, the kid was not a part of this neighborhood and lived quite some distance away. So again, we have people being set up and manipulated to some extent. It's a very interesting case. And just to briefly end it, because I don't want to go too long, he had an experience where he was very ill and with a chest cold. And this being pictured on the right here showed up and said, "Here, drink this." It was a vial filled with this neon pink liquid and handed it to him. And Don took the liquid. It was tasteless and somewhat viscous, and swallowed it and handed the vial back, and the being disappeared, and his chest cold quickly went away. Don does remember another experience following major heart surgery where he was taken on board and healed. He also had another experience involving praying mantis ETs, which approached him and showed themselves to him and his friends. It's a quite complicated encounter. And I won't go too much into it here because I want to wrap this up. I've got two more cases I want to tell you, and this one is a doozy. I was contacted by a lady from Indiana who took her son to the dentist in March 2012, and the dentists freaked out because this object appeared beneath his lower left molar on the x-rays. And they said, "What is this? Did you shoot yourself in the mouth with a BB gun?" The son denied it. They brought in the mother, asked her. She says, "No, that absolutely did not happen." And they said, "Well, what is this?" And she joked. She says, "I have no idea. I don't know what maybe it's an alien implant." She was just joking. But the dentists were freaking out. They did not laugh. And she had no explanation for it. She demanded the x-rays, which were given to her. And this began a journey for her to figure out what this could possibly be. She asked her son about it. He denied any knowledge of this. And she went to her other dentist, who she had visited a year earlier, and found out that, yeah, he had seen this anomaly a year earlier. And she asked for the x-rays. He refused to hand them over. But she had taken x-rays many times before this, and it was never there. So this was very odd. And finally, after almost a year of doing research, she hit upon UFOs. She was extremely reluctant to go there, but finally she did. And she thought, well, maybe this is an alien implant. By this point, they had gone back to the dentist and saw another x-ray in which this object appeared. You can see it right there. You can see it right there. Here's a close-up here and there. So this appeared on multiple x-rays. And finally, she started, contacting researchers, found me, sent me the x-rays, and asked me what I thought it was. And she said, before you ask, he's never shot himself with the BB gun. I'm like, okay, do you have any history of UFO encounters? And she said, no, and neither does he. And I said, are you sure? And she says, I'm pretty sure. I'm like, well, tell me about, any weird dreams. And she says, well, I did have a weird dream where my son was immersed in this liquid and he had huge dark eyes and he was breathing the liquid. I'm like, ooh, well, that's close, because I've heard similar things in UFO accounts, but they absolutely denied any UFO history. I sent the x-rays to a medical doctor and an emergency physician who both thought, is it a BB? And I said, no, it's actually a little bit larger than a BB, isn't it? And they said, well, yeah, we would diagnose this as a foreign body, and it's probably metallic. And the oral surgeon that the kid saw when he was having his wisdom teeth removed offered to take it out. He declined. He went to the dentist again. They took x-rays, it was there. They took a second set, it was gone. It was not there. They took a third set to verify it, and it was back again. It had moved or been taken out. One of the dental assistants was so upset she had to go home. She was just emotionally distraught over this. And the witness is like, can this happen? Can they disappear and come back? And I had to tell her, yes, this does happen. They can move around in people's bodies. It's pretty rare, but it does happen. And I asked her again, are you sure you have no UFO history? And she's like, yeah, we don't. I'm like, well, ask your son again. He would not be interviewed by me. He was, 14 when this all started happening. And he's very shy, and he's on the autism spectrum. So she turned and asked him again, have you ever seen a UFO? And he said, yes. And she said, why didn't you tell me? He says, I don't know. I didn't want to scare you. They're alone in the world. She's adopted. She's a single parent. They have no one to rely on. She's had a very rough time. She came from an abusive family. So he kept it secret. And now he told her that, yeah, right before all this happened, he and his friend were walking outside their home, and a UFO dropped very low over their heads and started flashing colored lights at them, scared them, and they ran home. And since then, he's been having dreams of human-looking ETs, Nordics, and he's obsessed about them. But that's as far as it goes. And so she likened herself to Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters, because she's just obsessed. She has to know what's going on. Why is her son being picked on like this? What is this? Is this an alien implant? And I said, well, given what you just told me, it sounds like it could very well be. But it's impossible to say for sure. But I think it is, in my own personal, professional opinion. I think this is what happened. Is there anything unusual about your son? And she said, oh, yeah, he's extremely psychic. Daily, he has premonitions. He's very clairvoyant. Synchronicity surrounds him. He glows with light. People approach him constantly. He exudes an innocence about him that attracts people to him. And this is a pattern I see. Many experiencers and contactees are the nicest people you have ever met. They are doing really good work for humanity. They're profoundly psychic. They have out-of-body experiences, past life recall, can do healing, all this sort of thing. And he's right there in that pattern. And she called me up a few months later and said, you're not going to believe what happened. I'm like, what? She says, the Greys came and told me that everything is fine. She woke up. Her son had come to sleep with her in the same room because he has trouble sleeping. They usually sleep with the night light or the hall light on. And she woke up and Greys were surrounding her son, working on him. And one stood by the doorway and looked right at her. It came right up to the doorknob. So very short, 3, maybe 4 feet tall, large dark eyes, typical Grey, and told her, everything's fine. You don't have to worry. Everything's okay. You're going to be okay. Everything's fine. Don't worry. And said it to her, she estimates 50 times, just reassuring her. She was in a quasi-awake state. She couldn't move, but she felt no fear whatsoever. And at some point, she first noticed it because lights were filling the room, colored lights. and it woke her up. And then she saw these grays surrounding her son. And at some point they just left, and she passed out, woke up the next morning and turned to her son and said, "They came." And he said, "What do you mean they came?" She says, "Gray aliens." And he said, "Really, Mom, they did? They came for you?" She said, "No, honey, they came for you." And he's like, "Oh, oh my God, I wonder if the implant is still there." And it was. They had a dental appointment a few weeks or months after that, and the implant was still there. And I reassured them that this is, you are definitely a contactee. This is a pattern I've seen in many cases. It's a good possibility there will be future experiences, which there was. She did finally admit that memories started coming back, and she said that there were times she found some unusual scars on her body. And she said there were times when she would go to bed and say, "Okay, it's okay if you come tonight and take me." And she would have missing time. So she started having memories of having experiences. And then she had one final experience, which I'd like to tell you about briefly, in which she woke up on board a craft, and it was very unusual looking inside. It was a roundish room with indirect lighting, but there was a couch and a carpet and a TV, and it looked like an office. And there was a gentleman, a human-looking gentleman, sitting on the couch in a somewhat dazed expression. There was a window outside of which she could see blue sky. And she says, "I'm sure this was a craft, but I feel like they were fixed it up to look like a living room or a doctor's office so that we wouldn't be frightened." And she had full freedom of movement, as did the gentleman. And they were just kind of talking. And he said, "Yeah, I'm being taken." And she said, "Yeah, me too." And at that point, a door whooshed open in an unusual way, sort of irised open. And in walked a 8-foot tall praying mantis ET, who held up what looked like a cell phone type device against the gentleman's neck. He was a young man, maybe 20s. And he became paralyzed and just stood there and let this praying mantis do his business. And then it came towards her. She said it was greenish in color. She couldn't tell if it was wearing anything or not. Its eyes were huge. And it scared her because it was so tall. And it held up this device, and she jumped up and said, "Nope, nope, you're not touching me with that." And that's the last she remembered. So that's where I'll end that experience. She's a wonderful lady. My heart really went out to this mother-son duo. They're just precious people. And I feel like they've become really good friends. They're just adorable. And now I want to move to the final case, which I'll go through quite quickly because it's very extensive. And I'll just summarize it. This lady had very horrific childhood experiences in Prunedale, California, involving bedroom visitations, ended up leaving home at a young age and moving to the opposite side of the country just to stop the experiences, which she could not explain, and it did, it worked. She began a period of nurturing and healing, met her husband, and was very happy and got a very strong impulse to move back to California, which they did, at which point she had this ringing sound in her ear, like tinnitus, went to the doctor. The doctor said it doesn't appear to be tinnitus. It was in one ear only. She thought maybe it was a bug and it would go away after 2 weeks, but it didn't. It got worse. She noticed a pattern. It would always appear when she was intimate with her husband, kissing, hugging, or engaging in intimacy. And it was ruining her life over a period of 2 to 3 years, driving her crazy, till one day she looked up to her skylight and saw a UFO, and she ran outside and accused it of putting an implant in her ear. It shocked her to hear those words coming out of her mouth. She's like, "You did this to me, didn't you?" And it darted away. And that's when she finally approached the subject of ETs and realized that she was a lifelong experiencer. And these ringing sounds continued until one day she woke up and she heard this music-like tone echoing through the house. She's walking through her house to locate the source when she realized it's coming from within her ear, at which point this light fills the room. It's filled with geometric triangles and squares and shapes. And next thing she knows, she's being pulled through a tunnel of light through the wall onto a craft. She's surrounded by grays who show her a hybrid baby and they ask her to hold it. She's repulsed. She does not want to hold it. And she can see through the walls. She can see the earth down below her. It's very small. And they keep trying to get her to hold it, and she refuses and is pulled back into her bedroom and wakes up, tells her husband. He's very supportive. These tones continued. She found out if she moved her pinky finger that she could end the experience. And she told her husband, if ever you see me moving my pinky finger, wake me up. And he did. And this would stop the whole experiences from happening successfully. But they started increasing in frequency until suddenly a gray appeared in their bedroom. He saw it. He jumped out of bed, knocked over the lamp, and the gray disappeared, ran out of the room. She found out she was pregnant. They had been trying to get pregnant, but she felt very concerned and afraid because the pregnancy did not feel normal. She said her stomach was hard as a rock. She was just very concerned and not happy, and suddenly had a spontaneous miscarriage. And she says, I hate to say it, but I was actually relieved. And following that, they did eventually have 2 kids. But that stopped these experiences. They moved back to the East Coast, and one day she decided to meditate and see if she could reach out to this hybrid child, and she did. She connected to this gray ET telepathically, and she could see him on board his craft, hovering over a water planet with a huge, strange, alien-looking tower. And she was getting ready for a doctor appointment. She was pregnant at the time. And she's like, wow, are you my son? And he said, no, but I was made with your genetics. And he said, what's your name? He said, my name is Sen. And we are related, but I am not technically your son. She said, why did you take me? Why have you been taking me? He said, well, we are having trouble reproducing. We have lost the ability to reproduce. We've bred emotions out of our race and need your genetics to reinvigorate our race. We are reintroducing emotions, which we lost because we genetically intervened to remove emotions, and so we could do space travel. She said, are you planning on taking over planet Earth? He said, no, you guys are far too emotional and aggressive. We have absolutely no interest in your planet whatsoever. There are many other planets that we can move to. We're interested only in your genetics and your emotions. You're very physical, emotional beings, and we are attracted to that because we ourselves are quasi-physical and almost astral. He said this in so many words and impressions. It was very much through images and impressions. And she asked how his chips work, and he showed her that we use magnetics in the magnetic fields of the planet, and did all sorts of whoop-de-whoops and loops and stuff, and demonstrated for her. She felt like she was inside the craft with him, while at the same time he was in the room with her. So she had this whole hour to 2 hour long conversation with this gray ET named Sen. And there was a number of other things he explained. Much of it went over her head. He was talking about genetics and science and emotions and quantum physics. She's very scientifically minded. She's a writer. And I won't go into any other details because it's a pretty extensive case, other than to say at some point, she's like, I have to go, stop talking. And he wanted to talk more. She sensed their time was limited together because he was very uncomfortable around her coarse emotions. And she felt somewhat awkward because he was very clinical. And she's like, that's it. I have to go to my doctor now. You have to say goodbye. And that ended it. And a couple of end notes to this case. She did go see a psychic tea leaf reader who looked into her teacup and said, oh my God, look at all these saucers. You're a contactee. And her friend was there, and her friend's like, what? And she had never told her friend. And she's like, well, what else do you see? She said, the ETs have been watching you for a long time. They said they don't want you to be afraid. We are here to help you. We are still in contact with you, but you don't need to have any fear of us. We are friendly and we are not here to hurt you. That was the gist of the message. I asked about her children, and she says her children are extremely healthy and have never gotten sick once. It really concerned her. She would expose them to colds and they would never catch one. She wanted them to build up their immunity. But a really neat, nice, funny lady. And she did one other experiment where she reached out telepathically. She's had a number of encounters with bad ghosts and is probably a medium, but absolutely does not want to pursue it. But did reach out one more time and came into contact with what she believes are the deceased souls of the many ET hybrid babies that she helped create. And she had a profound feeling of sadness because many of them did not survive. So that was the last time she ever tried to make telepathic contact. So that's basically my whole presentation here. I wanted to provide cases that I think provide a broad spectrum of the UFO phenomena and let everyone know the various aspects of it, and can show how these experiences can be very traumatic, but are actually ultimately good news. And people are spiritually transformed by it. The Greys are not here to take over our planet. The alien threat narrative, I don't think it's supported by actual evidence. I know people do have negative encounters. I've talked to them. But overall, I think this is good news for humanity. So thanks very much. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I went so over, but thanks very much.